My son's mother-in-law stood in my living room, looked around, and smiled. This house is perfect for a young couple, she said. Everyone at the table nodded along. I took a sip of coffee, looked her straight in the eye, and asked one question. Then why aren't they moving into yours? The room went silent. Nobody laughed. Nobody had an answer. My son stared at his plate like it owed him money. The daughter-in-law suddenly needed more water, even though her glass was nearly full, and the mother-in-law, who had walked through my front door 2 hours earlier with the easy confidence of a property assessor, took a full 30 seconds to find her voice. I counted those seconds. I want to be honest about that. I sat there with my coffee cup warm against my palm, and I counted because a long time ago my late husband taught me something about negotiations that I never forgot. He sold commercial equipment for 31 years, and he used to say that the person who breaks the silence first is the person who needed the deal more. So I held the silence like a hand of cards, and I waited. She recovered eventually. People like her always do. She laughed a small, dismissive laugh, the kind you give a child who has said something precocious at a funeral. Then she smoothed her napkin across her lap and explained, slowly, as if I were the one who had missed something obvious, that her townhouse simply wasn't suitable. 2 bedrooms, no real yard, the traffic on the main road never stopped, not even at 2 o'clock in the morning. She had lived there 11 years, and the noise still woke her. Whereas my house, she said, gesturing with her fork in a slow circle that took in my dining room, my hallway, the staircase my husband had refinished by hand the summer before he got sick, had 3 bedrooms, a garden, a quiet street, and only one person living in it. She let that last part sit on the table like a dish she expected me to pass around. Only one person, as if the square footage of my life had become a public resource, as if widowhood were a zoning issue. I looked at my son. He was 29 years old, and at that moment he was doing the thing he had done since he was 7, when he broke the garage window with a baseball and stood in the kitchen, studying his shoes while his friend explained that the wind did it. He was waiting for the adults to finish deciding his future so he could agree with whoever won. The daughter-in-law reached over and touched his arm. Not affection, coordination. I had spent enough years watching people across tables to know the difference. That touch was a cue, and on cue my son finally looked up and said the sentence I would replay for weeks afterward. It would just make sense, Mom. You have all this space. 26 years of mortgage payments summarized as available inventory. I didn't argue. That surprised them. I think I just smiled, told them dessert was apple pie, and asked who wanted coffee with it. The mother-in-law blinked at the change of subject like a cat that had pounced on a toy and come up with empty carpet. But she adjusted. She praised the pie. She complimented the china. She mentioned twice more before 9 o'clock how perfect the house was for a young couple, and I nodded and smiled and gave her absolutely nothing, because here is what 30 years of marriage to a salesman teaches you. When somebody walks into your home and starts measuring it with their eyes, you don't show them your hand. You show them the door eventually. But first you find out what they already know that you don't. They left at 9:40. I remember because the mother-in-law made a production of checking her watch and announcing she had an early appointment. And the way she said it, bright and significant, like the appointment itself was a character in our story. I would learn later that it was. But that night I just stood on my porch and watched their 2 cars pull away. My son's leased SUV and her sedan, tail lights and convoy. And I felt the particular quiet of a house that has just been raised. I went back inside and did the dishes by hand, even though the dishwasher works fine. I needed my hands busy while my head relayed the evening, because something about it had been wrong from the first. hour, and I couldn't yet name what. It wasn't the request itself. Adult. Children ask to move home all the time. Times are hard, rates are brutal, and if my son had come to me alone, sat at my kitchen counter the way he used to after school and said, "Mom, we're struggling," I would have heard him out. I want that on the record. I am not a woman who bolts the door against her own child. It was the choreography that was wrong. The mother-in-law had arrived. First 15 minutes before the kids, which I thought was odd at the time. She'd asked for the tour. She'd opened the hall closet, actually opened it, and remarked on the storage. She'd asked which bedroom got morning light. She'd asked, smiling, whether the basement was finished and whether it had its own entrance, and I had answered like a fool, like a hostess, proud of my home and happy to show it. By the time we sat down to eat, she had walked every room except mine. Then there was the timing of the pitch itself. She hadn't raised it during the meal when conversation was loose. She'd waited until dessert was nearly done, until the evening had been pleasant for 2 solid hours, until refusing would feel like riddance. My husband used to call that anchoring the goodwill. You don't ask for the signature until the client has laughed at your jokes and accepted your coffee. Then the ask doesn't feel like an ask. It feels like the natural next step of a lovely evening. This house is perfect for a young couple, said, while turning slowly in the middle of my living room, said, the way you say things, you have already decided, and the nodding that was the detail that kept snagging as I dried the same plate for the third time. When she said it, everyone at the table nodded along, not the startled, polite nod of people hearing an idea for the first time, the settled nod of people hearing the agreed upon idea finally said out loud. My son had nodded before she finished the sentence. The daughter-in-law had been watching me, not the mother-in-law, when the words landed, watching for my reaction. You only watch for the reaction when you already know the script. This had been rehearsed. I would have bet the house on it, which I suppose was exactly what they were hoping I'd do. I finished the dishes, turned off the kitchen light, and stood for a minute in my dark hallway, listening to the house settle. 26 years of payments, 14 years of 2 incomes, and 12 of 1. A roof I'd replaced after the hailstorm, a furnace I'd financed. The winter after the funeral, when everything still smelled like hospital, and I signed the loan papers at the kitchen table because I couldn't bear to let the house go cold. Only one person lives here, she'd said. That was true. But the one person had earned every board of it, and the one person had an excellent memory, and the one person was about to start writing things down. The text from my neighbor came 2 days later. On Thursday at 4:12 in the afternoon. I know the time because I screenshotted it, and I screenshotted it because by then I had started a folder. My neighbor is a retired escrow officer with 2 artificial knees and the sharpest gossip instincts in 3 counties. She walks the loop around our neighborhood every morning, and she scrolls rental listings the way other people do crosswords, partly from professional habit and partly because her daughter is house hunting. Her text said, "Isn't this your son's mother-in-law's place on Henderson?" followed by a link. I sat down at my kitchen table before I opened it. Some part of me already knew it was a rental listing, the mother-in-law's townhouse. I recognized it immediately from the Christmas party 2 years ago. The brick run, the maple by the door, the little iron railing she'd had repainted, except in these photographs. It had been staged professionally. Staged. To family photos were gone from. The mantle, the heavy floral furniture, had been replaced with the neutral gray staging pieces you see in every list. The listing had 11 photos, a floor plan, and a paragraph about charming urban convenience close to shopping and transit. The same traffic noise she'd complained about at my table was now urban convenience. 2 bedrooms, 1 and a half baths, $2,400 a month available. The first of next month. I read it 4 times. Then I did something I am not ashamed of, although I understand how it sounds. I created an email address that wasn't my name, and I inquired about the property. The property manager replied within the hour, friendly, efficient, eager, and in his second message, answering my question about availability, he wrote the sentence that turned my unease into certainty. The owner is relocating to live with family at the end of the month, so the unit will be ready for occupancy on the 1st. Relocating to live with family. The dinner at my house had been on a Tuesday. The listing, according to the website, had been posted the previous Friday. For days before anyone asked me anything, her townhouse was already photographed, staged, priced, and promised to the market. The early appointment sheet announced on my porch, bright and significant. I'd have put money on it being the property manager. She hadn't come to my house to ask a question. She had come to collect an answer she'd already spent. I printed the listing. I printed the property manager's emails. I put them in a manila folder, and I wrote the date on the tab. Because my husband used to say that paper remembers what people conveniently forget, and because I had been a bookkeeper for 19 years before I retired, and the habits of a bookkeeper do not retire with her, then I poured myself a glass of wine and made myself think about the part I'd been avoiding, which was not the mother-in-law at all. It was my son sitting at my table, nodding. Before the sentence finished, he had known her townhouse was already listed. He had watched her tell me it was too small, too noisy, unsuitable, while the photographs of it sat staged and beautiful on the internet. And he had said nothing except that it would just make sense. People lie for all kinds of reasons. Fear, shame, kindness, habit. I could forgive most of them, but there is a particular kind of lie where someone watches you being deceived in your own home, at your own table, eating food you cooked, and chooses the deceivers aside with their silence. I didn't know yet what was driving it, but the folder did not stay thin for long. The envelope arrived the following Tuesday exactly, 1 week after the dinner, wedged between a utility flyer and a seed catalog. It was addressed to my son, that my address with the words secondary contact printed under his name in the flat gray font that banks use when they want to look neutral while delivering bad news. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't think why anything of his would still rude to me. Then I remembered 8 years ago when he was 21 and determined to build credit. I had co-signed a car loan, a used sedan, $9,800, paid off ahead of schedule, traded in long ago. He'd refinanced things since moved. Banks leased the SUV. I had assumed the way you assume the stove is off, that my name had been scrubbed from every account that ever touched his. It had not. And because it had not, the bank's automated system, dutiful as a dog, had fetched me a copy of everything. I sat on the porch step and opened it, and I will tell you exactly what was inside, because the numbers matter, and I am tired of stories where the numbers stay vague. A mortgage delinquency notice. Their townhouse, the one they'd bought 2 years ago with the wedding money and a first-time buyer program. The adjustable rate had reset in the spring. The payment had jumped from 1th injured 40 to 2,005s, and they were 3 months behind. The notice was the second one. The language had moved from friendly reminder to required cure amount, and the cure amount was 8 107s. Behind it, a courtesy summary of linked accounts, the poison gift of that old signature, 2 credit cards, both within $200 of their limits, $31,400 combined. Minimum payments alone were over $700 a month, and the lease on the SUV $689 a month. 41 months remaining on a vehicle whose main job, as far as I could tell, was looking successful in driveways. I sat there a long time. Neighbor walked her dog past and waved, and I waved back with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else. Here is the thing nobody tells you about. Reading your child's financial collapse. In a bank's gray font, the anger comes second. First comes a horrible specific tenderness because the dates on the statements tell you a story. They were keeping up until March. In March, the rate reset. In April, the card started carrying groceries. There was a charge from a furniture store in May, $4,200. And I remembered the daughter-in-laws. Post that month, the new sectional, the caption about finally making it feel like home. In June, a weekend trip, a resort I recognized from photographs of. The two of them holding drinks at a pool's edge, smiling like people who had not received the first notice, which by the dates had arrived 11 days earlier. They were drowning and they had been posting pictures from underwater. I called my son that evening. I told him a letter had come for him, and I told him what kind. The silence on the line had a texture to it, thick and slow. I meant to tell you, he said finally. Tell me. What exactly? It's not as bad as it looks. The rate jumped. We've been juggling. I looked at the folder on my kitchen table at $897 and $31,400 and $689 a month. And I asked him the question whose answer I already veered. Is this why everyone was measuring my house last Tuesday? Another silence. Then, Mom, it would just be temporary. That word again. I told him good night. And I sat down and I added the bank envelope to the folder. And the folder, I noticed, had developed a spine. I'm going to tell you about the drive I took on Saturday morning because it is the part of the story where I stopped being a hurt mother and started being a bookkeeper again. And the difference between those two women is that one of them verifies. I drove to Henderson Road. I told myself it was on the way to the garden center, which was true in the sense that anything is on the way to anywhere if you are willing to add 20 minutes. I parked across the street from the townhouse 2 doors down with a coffee, and I just looked. There was a lockbox on the door. The little maple had been mulched. Through the front window, I could see the gray staging. Furniture from the photographs angled to catch the light. A lawn sign for the property management company stood by the walk. And as I sat there, a young couple arrived and a man in a quarter zip let them in with a lockbox code and swept his arm around the entryway the way men in quarter zips do, a showing 3 weeks before the supposed family decision about where everyone would live. Her townhouse was getting showings. The woman watering planters next door turned out to be the kind of neighbor every bookkeeper dreams of. I complimented her geraniums, which were genuinely good, and within 10 minutes I knew everything the owner was moving in with. Her daughter and son-in-law. Isn't that nice? Multi-generational living is so smart with prices the way they are. The listing had 3 applications already, and the part that made my coffee go cold, a couple school teachers had been approved that week. Lease signed, move in on the first, signed, not pending, signed. I want to walk you through the arithmetic the way I walked through it, sitting in my car, because arithmetic was the only thing keeping my hands steady. The mother-in-law's townhouse was paid off. She'd mentioned it at the wedding, the way she mentioned things modestly, and twice. So $2,400 a month in rent was not covering a mortgage. It was income, pure lovely retirement cushion. Income, $28,800 a year minus the management fee, but that income only existed if she had somewhere free to live. The kids couldn't house her. They were 3 months behind on a mortgage and drowning in car debt. And besides, they were supposed to be moving to the plan was never the young couple in my house while she stayed in hers. The plan, the only plan the numbers supported, was all 3 of them under my roof. The kids escape a $265 payment they can't make. She converts her townhouse into $2,400 a month. My house absorbs 3 adults, their boxes, their SUV, their habits, and their consequences. My house was the foundation of everyone's recovery plan, except mine, and not one of them had asked me before the lease was signed. That was the detail I kept circling, parked there with my cold coffee. The teachers had signed before my answer existed, which meant my answer was never a variable in whatever conversations happened in whatever living rooms over however many weeks. The question of whether I would say yes had been treated as settled, pleasant, lonely, only one person in all that space. She'll come around. She has to. I thought about my husband then, who once walked away from the biggest commission of his year because the client kept calling his pricing a starting point. You can negotiate anything with me, he told them, except the things you've already decided you're taking. I drove home. I skipped the garden center, and on Sunday, I called my son and invited everyone to dinner the following Saturday. My voice warm as pie, and they accepted instantly because, of course, they did. They thought the deal was closing. I cooked for that second dinner. The way you load a dishwasher when you're furious, precisely and a little too well. Roast chicken, the good potatoes. I set the table with the everyday plates, though not the china, because I have my limits and because some part of me felt that people about to be shown the door should not eat off my mother's wedding pattern. They arrived in convoy again. The mother-in-law brought wine and a new warmth, the expansive friendliness of a woman who believes the papers are all but signed. She kissed my cheek. She called the house cozy this time instead of perfect, which I noted because cozy is what you call a thing you already own. We ate. They talked about everything except the only thing anyone was there to discuss, and I let them because I had learned the anchoring trick from the best, and I saw no reason not to use it in my own dining room. I served the pie. I poured the coffee, and when the mother-in-law set down her fork, drew breath and began, "So have you given any more thought to?" I said, "Yes, actually I had." And I went and got the folder. I wish I could describe the silence that came over my table when I set it down, but you were there for the first silence, the one after my question about her townhouse, and this one was its older, heavier sister. I took out the rental listing first and slid it across the table to her, the photographs facing up, 11 pictures of her staged living room, $2,400 a month. Available. The first, your townhouse. I said, the one that's too small and too noisy. It photographs beautifully. Her face did something complicated. The daughter-in-law looked at her mother the way you look at a grenade someone has just set gently on the tablecloth. "You've been in contact with my property manager," the mother-in-law said, and her voice had a new register in it. Flat and quick, the performance gone. "I've been in contact with a rental listing on the public internet," I said. "Then I had a nice chat with your neighbor about the school teachers. Congratulations on signing them. I hear good tenants are hard to find." My son said, "Mom, just that." I took out the bank envelope next and laid it in front of him. "And this came to my house because your name and my name are still holding hands on a loan from when you were 21, 3 months behind. The cure amount is $89,997. The cards are at $31,400. The truck is $689 a month." I kept my voice level the whole time. I had practiced. "So let's stop discussing my square footage and start discussing your arithmetic." And then it came apart the way these things do, not in one confession, but in shards. The daughter-in-law crying that everyone their age lives this way. My son saying the rate reset wasn't their fault, which was true, and saying nothing about the sectional or the resort, which was the part that wasn't. And the mother-in-law cornered, going not soft but hard, leaning back and saying the things she'd come there believing. Families consolidate. It's done everywhere. You have 3 bedrooms and you rattle around in them alone. We were going to handle everything. You wouldn't have lifted a finger. Honestly, you should be grateful for the company. Grateful. So, the plan, I said, was all 3 of you in my house while your townhouse pays you $2,400 a month. It would have been temporary, my son said. The teacher signed a 2-year lease, I said, and watched him learn in real time in front of me that he didn't know that. His head turned toward her slowly, like a door, opening onto a room he'd never been allowed inside. So there was a script. He just hadn't been given all the pages either. The mother-in-law left first. There is a kind of departure that is really a tactical retreat, coat gathered with dignity, goodbye aimed at the room, rather than the people in it, and she executed it beautifully. The daughter-in-law followed her out to the cars, and through the window I watched them stand under the streetlight, the mother talking fast and low, the daughter with her arms folded, and whatever was passing between them did not look like an apology in either direction. My son stayed. He came into the kitchen while I was scraping plates, picked up a dish towel out of 29 years of habit, and stood there holding it without drying anything. 2 years, he said. She signed them for 2 years. Ask her, not me. She told us month to month. She said if it didn't work out at your place, she could take the townhouse back whenever. He sat down hard on the kitchen stool. My wife knew. She had to have known. I noticed he could say his wife had to have known faster than he could say his mother-in-law had lied. And I noticed that even now, in the wreckage, the words at your place came out of his mouth like a destination that still existed. I put down the pan I was scrubbing. I need you to hear something, I said, and I need you to hear it as a fact and not a punishment. Nobody is moving into this house. Not you, not her, not anyone. Not for a month. Not while we figure things out. Not temporarily. The word temporary is doing a lot of work in your life right now, and I'm retiring it. We're drowning. Mom, I know. I've read the statements more carefully than you have. That landed. I let it. And drowning people need 2 different things depending. Some need rescue. Some need swimming lessons. The cruelest thing I could do, the genuinely cruel thing, would be to let 3 adults float on my deed for 2 years while a $31,000 hole keeps growing. Because nobody's lifestyle ever had to meet its own income. So you'll just watch us lose the townhouse. I'll watch the bank apply the terms you signed. Yes. And then I will do something better than rescue you. I took the chair across from him the way I used to for homework. I'll sit with you and a counselor and a budget every week if you want. I'll pay for the counseling myself. I'll teach you everything a bookkeeper knows about climbing out of a hole, which is a great deal. What I will not do is become the hole's new bottom. He was quiet for a long time. The dish towel was still in his hands, twisted now into a rope. You always said you'd help if I ever really needed it, he said. It wasn't an accusation by then. It was a boy checking whether the floor of the world was where he'd left it. This is what help looks like when it's real, I said. It's slower and it hurts more. Rescue is me handing you the finish line of my whole life, so nobody has to admit a race happened. You'd be back in this kitchen in 5 years, and the only difference is we'd both be 5 years older, and the hole would have my house in it, outside a car. Horn twice polite, but not patient, his wife. He stood, put the towel down, and at the door he paused with his hand on the frame my husband had painted, and said, I didn't know about the lease. I need you to believe that. I believe you, I said, and I did, and it was somehow the worst part of the whole evening, because it meant my son hadn't sold my house out from under me. He just nodded along while someone else did. Monday morning, I called my attorney, a calm woman with a corner office and a habit of saying interesting when she means alarming. And by Thursday, I was sitting across her desk with my folder, which she read in silence twice. Interesting, she said. We spent 2 hours building the wall. The house went into a living trust, with terms that no dinner party could amend. No early distribution, no informal occupancy, inheritance, contingent on completed financial counseling, demonstrated solvency, and 0 obligations co-signed in my name. We documented that no one held a key, except my neighbor. We drafted, and this felt like science fiction until she explained how often she does it. A letter to be sent if anyone ever claimed tenancy rights in my home, because she told me the fastest way to lose control of your house is to let someone receive mail there. I thought of the bank envelope with my son's name on it and my address under it, and I asked her to add a forwarding correction to the list. She smiled like a woman who had seen that exact envelope 100 times. Then I drove to the bank and removed my name from the last living artifact of that old car loan, and the woman at the desk processed it in 9 minutes. And I want to tell you that severing the final financial thread between yourself and your child takes longer than 9 minutes. But it doesn't. It just feels like it should. The pressure campaign started that weekend. It came the way it always comes now, sideways and online. The mother-in-law posted a long reflection about how family means showing up and how some generations had forgotten the meaning of sacrifice over a stock photograph of hands holding hands. 41 likes. 2 of them were my cousins. Then the phone calls began. A niece I hear from at Christmas, suddenly curious how I was doing all alone in that big house. My late husband's sister telling me she'd heard the kids were going through it and that I of all people had room to spare. Each call arranged like a wreath around the same idea, delivered in the same borrowed phrases. Consolidate, multi-generational, all that space. She was working the family the way the man in the order zip worked the entryway. I didn't argue with any of them. I had retired from arguing the night of the second dinner. I just said the same sentence pleasantly every time. If she's so passionate about multi-generational living, her townhouse rents for $2,400 a month and family gets a discount. I'm sure the calls got shorter after that. Word travels in a family like water, through a wall slowly, then all at once. And by the 3rd week, the niece had gone quiet, and my sister-in-law had switched to asking about my tomatoes. My son called twice during all this, not about the house. The first time to tell me they'd met with a counselor, my counselor, the one I'd offered, and that the first session had been, his word, brutal. The second time to ask a question that told me the lessons were landing somewhere real. When you and Dad were behind in the early years, what did you cut first? The car, I said. We shared one for 6 years. Your father biked to the train in the rain and called it cardio. He was quiet. The SUV cost $689 a month, and I knew he was doing the math, and I knew the math was winning because 3 days later the daughter-in-law posted a photograph of a sunset with no caption at all. And in my experience, a woman who posts a sunset with no caption has just lost an argument to a spreadsheet. The truck went back at the end of the month. The townhouse went on the market in October. I found the listing myself this time. No neighbor required, because by then I had alerts set up like any reformed bookkeeper would. The photographs broke my heart a little, I'll admit it. The sectional from May, the $4,200 sectional, staged at an angle in a living room they were about to lose. Motivated sellers. The listing said, which is realtor for. The bank is circling. It's sold in 19 days below what they owed. The shortfall and the closing costs ate the last of their equity, and 2 years of payments dissolved into a wire transfer and a signature. My son told me the final number on the phone, flat-voiced, and I didn't soften it for him, and he didn't ask me to, and I considered that progress for both of us. And then came the question that the whole scheme had been built to avoid. Where does everyone live now? Walk the chessboard with me. because every piece was exactly where. The mother-in-law had moved it. Her townhouse, the paid-off one, the retirement cushion, had school teachers. In it, a signed binding 2-year lease. The lease, she told the kids, was month to month. She could not take it back without buying the teachers out, and the teachers sensibly were not selling. My house, the cornerstone of the entire arrangement, had a trust around it and a bookkeeper inside it. The kids' townhouse belonged to a relocation company now, which left for 3 adults, and their boxes, the open market they had all been so eager to rent her townhouse into. They found a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side, 3rd floor, no elevator. What letter are $1,985 a month? I know the number because my son sends me the budget now. Every month, a habit the counselor started and he kept. And here is the arithmetic that I would call poetic if it didn't involve my own family. The mother-in-law moved in with them into the 2nd bedroom, paying 1/3 of the rent out of the $2,400 her townhouse collects from the teachers. Money that arrives on the 1st of every month like a small monthly invoice from her own cleverness. She rented out the home she owned, lost the home she planned to take, and ended up a tenant in her children's apartment, subsidized by strangers sleeping in her bed. I heard how it was going, the way you hear everything now sideways. The SUV was gone, so my son took the bus to work. 40 minutes with a transfer, and the mother-in-law's sedan became the household's only car, which became, I am told, a weekly negotiation with minutes of grievance read into the record. The daughter-in-law took a part-time job at a dental office, her first paychecks in 2 years. The hallway filled with boxes that had no closet to go to. A neighbor below them complained about footsteps. The mother-in-law posted less than she posted nothing. Then in February, she deactivated the account entirely, and my cousin called me within the hour to report it lists like a war correspondent. I stayed out of all of it. I want that understood. I didn't gloat. I didn't check in with pointed kindness. I didn't drive past the apartment, and when people fished, I talked about my tomatoes. I had my routines, my book club, my garden, my quiet rooms that no one was measuring anymore, but I kept every receipt of every offer I'd made, the counseling, the budgeting, the weekly table, because I knew this family well enough to know how the story would eventually be told. And sure enough, by spring, the version going around was that I had thrown my children to the wolves. Nobody mentioned that I'd offered to teach them to be wolves. Proof. That part never makes the family newsletter. The mother-in-law called me on a Thursday afternoon in April, 14 months, nearly to the day after she stood in my living room and raised it. I almost didn't answer. Her name on my screen had the quality of a fire alarm in a building you've already left, but a bookkeeper answers because information is information. So I picked up, and the first thing I noticed was the voice. The performance was gone out of it. What was left was thinner, older, and very tired. I need to ask you something, she said. No greeting, and I need you to be honest because everyone in this apartment has stopped being honest with me. All right, did you know the teachers would renew? It took me a moment. The 2-year lease was coming up. The teachers, the sensible, rent-paying, noise-free teachers had apparently exercised their renewal option at a market bump for 2 more years. Entirely their right. It was in the lease she'd signed. The lease she had been waiting out month by month, sleeping in her daughter's 2nd bedroom, telling herself it was temporary. There was that word again. Come home to roost on her windowsill. This time, I didn't know, I said. Truthfully, but I could have told you. Renewal options usually belong to the tenant. It's their home now. That's what a lease means. The silence on the line was long, and inside it I could hear a television in another room and a tap running, and the particular density of 3 adults in 900 feet. They won't budge on anything, she said, and now it came out of her in a tired flood, and that it had no fixed address. It meant the teachers. It meant the kids. It meant the walls the daughter-in-law had stopped speaking to her over the lease, over the month-to-month lie which had finally surfaced the way buried things do in the middle of an argument about the car. My son worked late on purpose. She was sure of it. She had looked at studio apartments and the rents had genuinely frightened her. She'd consulted someone about breaking the teacher's lease and been told the buyout would cost her 5 figures. She did not have liquid because her cushion, her beautiful $2,400 cushion, was going out the door each month as rent and groceries and her share of a parking space for a sedan she barely got to drive. I had it all set up, she said, and I believe she had forgotten she was talking to me at all by then. Everyone would have been fine. Everyone would have been comfortable if you had just. She stopped herself. But I am not a merciful woman in April. Say it, I said. If you had just said yes. There it was. After 14 months, the architecture of her entire mind, my one syllable, the load-bearing wall of people's lives. I waited a moment to be sure my voice would come out level, because what I felt was not triumph. I want to be precise about this. What I felt was the cold, clean confirmation of a balanced ledger. Your plan needed my house more than it needed my consent. I said, you did get one thing right, though. This house is perfect for a young couple. It was 26 years ago when the young couple bought it. She was quiet. Then she said something I did not expect. The only wise sentence I ever heard her say. He's not who you think he is. You know your son. You think I dragged him into this? A small, exhausted laugh. Ask him what he had drafted in March before your lovely first dinner. Ask him about the paper I refused to be part of. And she hung up and left me standing in my kitchen, holding the phone in a silence with a brand new shape. He came on Sunday. I didn't tell him why, and he didn't ask, which told me something all by itself. Because an innocent man asks. We sat at the kitchen table, the homework table, the budget table, the table where every important transaction of his life had cleared, and I repeated her sentence to him word for word. Ask him what he had drafted in March. I watched my son age in front of me, not metaphorically. Something in his face let go of a weight it had been holding at altitude for over a year, and the drop aged him, and what landed on the table between us the following Sunday, after a week in which neither of us called the other, was 3 pages stapled, creased in quarters. From living in a drawer, temporary residency and occupancy agreement, the top of it said, I read it the way I used to read contracts for my old firm twice. Once for what it said, and once for what it did. The daughter-in-law has a cousin, a paralegal, and in March, before the first dinner, before the pie, before this house is perfect for a young couple, the cousin had drafted this at my son's request. It was dressed up as protection for me. That was the genius of it. And I used the word genius with a mouthful of ash. Clauses about respecting the homeowner's rules. A schedule of contributions toward utilities voluntary. It said language about the arrangement continuing month to month until a mutually agreed transition. And buried in the 4th paragraph, doing all the real work, a single sentence establishing the occupant's residency at my address for all purposes effective on signing. My attorney had explained it to me a year ago without knowing she was doing it, back when she added the mail clause to our wall. Once someone establishes residency, she'd said they're not guests anymore. They're tenants, lease or no lease, money or no money. You can't change the locks on a tenant. You can't pack their boxes. You go to court. You serve notice. You wait out the calendar. And if it's your own son, you do all of that with your name and his in the public record. And most mothers fold long before the docket clears. The plan had never needed my generosity to last. It had only needed my signature once at a warm moment over coffee, Just a formality. Mom, the cousin says we should keep things clean for insurance. The teacher's lease was the mother-in-law's scheme. This paper was my son's. She refused to sign it. He said quietly, that's what she meant on the phone. She read it and she said, and I'll never forget it. She said, you don't put a leash on the dog whose house you're sleeping in. She wanted Charm to do the work I wanted. He stopped and made himself finish, and I will give him that much. He made himself finish. I wanted a guarantee in case you changed your mind about us once we were in. In case I changed my mind, I repeated. So the silence at dinner, the nodding along. You weren't going along with her plan. I had my own. The clock. My husband wound every Sunday for 30 years ticked 11 times. I counted all those months I had carried a version of that first night where my son's worst crime was weakness. A boy in a kitchen who let stronger voices speak for him. A boy I believed when he stood in my doorway and said I didn't know about the lease, and that had been true. He hadn't known about her trap. He'd been too busy folding mine into quarters. He was still talking. I could see his mouth moving. The counseling vocabulary coming out of it. Accountability. Transparency. That's why I'm showing you. The counselor said, the only way forward is the whole truth. And it was the whole truth. 14 months late, stapled and creased. Sitting between the salt and pepper shakers like a bill that had finally found its address. I picked up the agreement and read the 4th paragraph. One more time. Effective on signing. There was a line at the bottom for the homeowner. Under the blank and clean paralegal type, my full legal name was already filled in. They had typed my name before the first dinner, before the pie, before the question that started. All of this before nobody laughed and nobody had an answer. My name was already waiting at the bottom of a document I had never seen under a sentence designed to make my own front door something I would need a judge's permission to close. Say something, my son said. Please. So I went to the hall closet, the one she'd opened on her tour, and I took down my folder, the one with a spine now, and I found what I was looking for and set it in front of him, the way he had set his 3 pages in front of me. The trust dated in April, 13 days after his agreement was drafted. As it turned out, though neither of us had known we were in a race. You had yours drawn up in March, I said. I had mine in April. The difference is what they were built to do. Yours was built to take a house. Mine was built to keep one. And there's one more difference. I turned to the page with the conditions, the counseling, the solvency, the clean credit, the clauses I'd had written when I still thought I was protecting myself from her, and I tapped the line my attorney had added almost as an afterthought, the one that voided any inheritance for a beneficiary who had ever attempted to establish occupancy without my written, notarized consent. He read it. I watched him read it twice, once for what it said and once for what it did, and I watched him understand that the clause had been sitting in a drawer for 14 months, describing exactly what was sitting in his. Mom, he said, did you know when you had this written? Did you already know about my agreement? And there it was, the question that mattered more to him than the house, more than the inheritance, more than the teachers or the apartment, or any of the wreckage. Had his mother seen all the way through him a year before he confessed? I looked at my son, my late staring, towel twisting quietly, the nodding son who had brought me the whole truth like an offering and was now learning what whole truths cost. The clock ticked outside. A car went by slow on the quiet street, the street the mother-in-law had raised on her tour. Answer me honestly, he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of it. Did you know? I folded his agreement back along its creases into quarters, the way it had lived in his drawer all those months, and I slid it across the table to him, and I gave him the only inheritance that was ever guaranteed in this family, the the one his grandmother gave me, the one this house was built on. You'll find out, I said, what I knew, and when I knew it the same way I found out everything in the story. He stared at me. When the paperwork